Hi everyone, my name is Natalie. Oh, starts in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hey everyone, and I'll be moderating this panel. Today we have Earning Trust, Intersections of Privacy, Data, and LGBTQ plus Safety. We're going to go ahead and get started with a few introductions throughout this panel. If anyone has any questions you want to ask the panelists or even myself, just feel free to leave them in the chat and mention whoever it is that you want to ask. So without further ado, I'm Natalie. I am the founder of CryptoFem. It's an organization that promotes Web3 and crypto literacy education for women and femme-identifying people. And our purpose is to bring more women into the Web3 space professionally, or anyone who's just like crypto curious and wants to learn about crypto, maybe diversifying their investment portfolio. We also help with that without diving into the realm of financial advice. And now I'm going to go ahead and let the panelists themselves introduce themselves. Let's go ahead and start with Gary.
Hey everyone, my name is Gary. My pronouns are he, him, and his, and I'm the Senior Program Director of Out Tech. We're a global nonprofit that unites the LGBTQ plus tech community, and we create opportunities for our members to advance their careers, to find jobs in the tech industry, to grow their networks and connect with each other, and then to leverage tech for social change. And one of the things that we do is one of our impact programs called Digital Core, where we provide tech tools for LGBTQ plus activists. And so that's sort of what I'll be talking about today. And if you're wondering why I have an accent, it's because I am from France. I was gonna popcorn it over, but Natalie, you decide who goes next.
How about Anya?
Hi, my name is Anya Bedford. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Olaplex. To my personal life, I'm German, lived in Germany, London, UK, and now here in the beautiful US. I used to work at Deutsche Bank for 12 years, so I went from serious banker and jumping right into Web3. At Olaplex, as the COO, what we are doing is we create, manage, analyze, or allow tooling for that to create, manage, analyze NFTs to allow, for example, loyalty and reward campaigns, or actually also use NFTs for other activities that they may want, and also work very closely with Web3 companies. George.
Awesome. Hi everyone, my name is George. I'm currently working at Apple on its product affordability strategy. So I'm very interested in the topic we're discussing today, not because I deal with privacy a lot in my day-to-day job working in technology, but also because unfortunately last year I was surviving from an online harassment and cyberbullying for some reason. So this experience has prompted me to really want to research and learn more about the digital safety space, both on my job and outside of work. So I have grown up in Asia before I moved to the US. I've also lived in Europe for a while. So I have witnessed the different types of challenges facing our LGBTQ communities regarding digital safety and privacy. So I want to be able to also share those intercultural perspectives during the discussion today. So I think we have an extremely, with Anya, with Natalie and Gary, I really would look forward to having a conversation to, brainstorm, evaluate, and maybe carve out a framework that tech companies, large and small, they can use to build trust and just better protect our community. So look forward to the conversation.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to go ahead and turn my camera off as well, just to help with the internet and data. I'm not sure if some people have a delay, but we'll just keep our cameras off from now on, just to make sure everything goes smoothly. Let's get right into it. So, Gary, what sorts of global risks do LGBTQ people face in cybersecurity in 2023?
Yes, so hopefully this is not like the bummer part of the the conversation and the panel, but about to spew a few facts that aren't the most joyful. And just to kind of contextualize, Natalie, your question has global, so I will answer this from like a global perspective. One fact that some people may not be aware of is that there are still 63 countries. It's all semantics, but between 60 and 70 countries that still criminalize LGBTQ plus same-sex consensual activities. And so you can think of the worst case scenarios, like the 5 countries where you still have the death penalty for being queer, and then some other ones that have less stringent laws, but still has queer people face imprisonment. And then in those 60 to 70, that doesn't include some countries like Russia, where there's no explicit anti-LGBT law, but there's an anti-propaganda law, which basically says that you can't be queer freely. Or even in South Africa, where even though you have same-sex marriage, the reality is really difficult for lots of people. For example, corrective rape for queer women. So because there are these real risks, of course, people who use internet and who use technical tools are at risk. There's never been a time where governments that are anti-LGBT or any kind of attackers who are anti-LGBT have had more tools or opportunities to really attack and target queer people. Just like last week, Uganda passed into law a new anti-homosexuality law, which basically calls for 20 years in prison for the vaguely defined crime of promotion of homosexuality. So within this context, I think it's more important than ever that LGBTQ plus people globally, and not just activists and organizations working towards legalization of LGBTQ plus people, are aware and educate themselves on very basic concepts of cybersecurity. If you wanted some concrete examples of risks that were faced, a few years ago, the police used Grindr in Egypt to be able to target and attack queer people, where they would set up meetings with them and then arrest them. And just a few weeks ago, I got a message from an LGBT activist in Ethiopia who was saying that TikTok was being used to display slideshows of people who were presumably LGBTQ plus, and this was being used to attack, to dox them, and to attack them. And then even in the US, you sort of now have a political landscape where states like Texas, Tennessee, and Florida are passing pretty stringent anti-LGBTQ laws, banning drag performances and gender-affirming care for minors, and talking about LGBTQI topics in schools. Therefore, we're at a stage where sharing or publishing data could be a risk. If you're thinking about a state like Mississippi, you could be liable if you do not report or if you knowingly aid or abet minors into getting gender-affirming care. You could be liable, and this includes parents. So, it's a bizarre context, and I'm looking forward to getting more into some other questions around what we can do to protect ourselves.
No, it's okay. I mean, it was some reason.
That makes sense. Yeah, it's definitely terrible what's going on around the world. Obviously in the recent years, the US has gotten worse, but it's still, really casts into light that what we deal with here is nothing compared to what some of these other countries are doing to LGBTQ people.
So,
Anya, with that in mind, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Maybe let's, Tariq, I don't know if you can hear us, but maybe you can mute yourself. I don't know if you can hear us.
All right, let's go to Anya next. How can Web3 technology be used to protect the privacy of LGBTQ people?
Yeah. So for those of you who may not know what Web3 stands for, it's usually blockchain technology. Behind it, sometimes people also throw in the metaverse. So when I talk about applications, it's kind of referencing these two pieces. So for me, the promise of Web3 is radically open, but it's also very protective of actually our needs, if you think about it. One piece is that there is a lot of decentralization. So there's not a central entity that will decide what can be shared and what can be censored, which is actually pretty great, especially in our case.
Yeah, oh my God,
Further, you actually own your own data, and you can decide what to share with whom and when you want to share it. That means actually you have greater control over your personal information, and also you can avoid unwanted exposures. Further, right, like with that idea in mind, right, like you have your own self-sovereign identity. You can create your own identity that reflects who you actually are. You can, right, like reflect your gender, your sexual orientation, without actually requiring any approval from a centralized authority. With concerns to privacy and security, is you can enhance some privacy and security through the cryptographic techniques that crypto offers.
And there's
You can remain anonymous or pseudonymous, actually. in that case, and especially in those regions, right, like where people are actually discriminated or face prosecution, what could that be? For example, in order to log into an app right now, nowadays, it's required to use an email address, but maybe going into the future, you can actually use just a wallet address that kind of just provides your wallet and without actually collecting any personal data. Still, right, like this is just a technology, and I think to Gary's point, it has to work together, right, like with the right legislations, the education, and the societal attitudes, because in the end, this technology is just a tool to help us protect ourselves, but everything else that I just mentioned also has to go into lockstep.
Yeah. If anyone is unmuted right now and they're not speaking, please go ahead and just mute your mic in case there's some feedback that we're all hearing. Anya, you make some really good points. You know, I have a background in Web3 and crypto as well. I definitely see some of these applied out that can be used to protect people's data and privacy. It's definitely an interesting space, and you know, there's a lot of negative publicity, but I think that given the right regulation and treatment of it, it can create a lot of good and social benefit for the world. Let's go to George. How do some governments use surveillance to suppress queer-affirming social media accounts and posts?
Yeah, absolutely. Before that, I definitely want to echo with Anya and Gary. I think we're aware of all of these very salient and very nasty risks around the globe. And these risks are introduced by government, by companies, but at the same time, we probably will have some emergent technology that help us to protect us from these digital attack and privacy invasion. So in terms of privacy, I do want to elaborate a little bit more on how I see privacy and its importance to human development. So when I look at concept like digital safety and privacy, I feel like it basically includes our both online and offline activities, you know, our interactions, our communications, our online searches. And if you think about it, like privacy really is a core part of our human development because it carves out this invisible space with our bodies and mind so that we can just develop our sense of self, our growth and identity without any other concerns or like any other people will invade our personal space. So when we talk about the right to privacy or the right to getting digital safety when we're online, I feel like that is basically the extent to which our innermost thoughts and desires and relationship with others are shared openly. So when it comes to, you know, governments are backing up some agency or like government are directly destructing these privacy or digital safety for us, is basically destroying the human development of LGBTQ community. So when I think about the surveillance you know, the methods that governments are using to suppress queer affirming social media accounts and posts, I think there are mainly 4 categories of surveillance. So first of all, I think it's the most commonly known, which is the removal of content and the censorship of content. So that includes, you know, deletion of your social media account entirely without any prior notice, or just, you know, censoring part of your content so important information will never be able to be shared to the public. The second category is hacking that is backed up by the government agency. So, you know, unauthorized access to your account, police getting unauthorized access to your account or like your information or in your interaction with others online, or just outright stealing of your personal data without any consent. So that is hacking backed up by the government agency. The third type of government backup method is misinformation campaign. So when we talk about this, we're just basically talking about the war of information. You know, there could be abusive campaigns like justifying, let's say, the sexuality correction treatment, or like the campaigns about, you know, just spreading very harmful narrative about LGBTQ community and their advocacy. So like these spreading of misinformation and hate speech backed up by government agency are also pretty common. And lastly, we also have surveillance laws and regulation that are justified by the consideration of national security law or public safety law. As Gary mentioned earlier in the session, in Russia, we have this anti-gay propaganda law. Basically, that prohibits the promotion of any non-traditional sexual relationship to minors. And Russian government has been using this law to justify any censorship or removal of LGBTQ content. So thinking about this, like different categories that governments are using to suppress queer affirming social media content, I think that's very concerning.
Yes, here. And I think Natalie probably had low connection, but I have access to a list of questions. So I can already kind of seamlessly take on. I know that Natalie was going to ask about everyday resources that LGBTQ plus people can use to protect themselves online. Well, first off, I think attending this panel is a really good way to do it because the two of you just shared a lot of great nuggets. And by the way, Sky, I see in your questions that we're going to address this very question. So in terms of everyday resources to actually stay safe online, there's a lot of things that you can do as an LGBTQ plus person, as a person online to be safe. The first thing that may be interesting is for you to actually take time to review how much personal information you provide on social networking sites, right? How much information do you willingly share and how much information is out there and who has access to it? And then there's a lot of things that you can do that you've heard before, but actually, are you doing them? Things for, do you have a password manager? Do you use the same password for everything, or do you actually have OnePass or LastPass that allow you to really store safely in a cryptographic way all of your passwords? Are your passwords at least 12 characters long, complex, and as I mentioned, unique to each of your accounts? There's so much, and I feel like we've gotten pretty good at identifying phishing attempts, right? If I get a request for some foreign government asking for some funds, I won't respond. But there's definitely some smart social engineering techniques that are ever evolving. People who are DMing you, who are sending you messages that may, be suspicious. If you are suspicious of something, it probably is for a reason. And so do never share information about your banking information or your personal identity in an email or via a phone call. And I think, well, actually, before I go into the fact that we need more LGBTQ plus people in tech, there's other ones that pertain to being queer specifically, right? So if you are using a hookup app and you are in a country where it's dangerous to be queer, never agree to meet someone for the first time at your home or their home. Maybe opt for a public place, which would be the perfect spot to catch a catfish, if there is one. And then there's a few resources where you can see all of these recommendations. First up, an organization I want to shout out is Frontline Defenders. They've done incredible work when it comes to digital safety. And then Out in Tech developed a website called safequeers.org. Now, this is specifically for queer activists around the world who, operate in these at-risk countries. But all of these principles, whether it's, encrypting your drive, using a VPN, or safely browsing the internet, are valid for everyone. So I recommend that you familiarize yourself with the tools listed on here. It's very simple stuff. There's lots of great open source tools. If you don't want to use WhatsApp, you can use Signal. If you don't want to use Zoom or Skype, you can use Jitsi. All of these are essentially encrypted tools that are open source and that will not store your information. And then the last thing I really want to shout out is that we do need more LGBTQ plus people in the tech industry. There is an underrepresentation of queer and trans folks who develop these products and who do so in a safe way. I think the more you add people who are directly targeted by a product to build them, the more they will do it with care and intentionality. So that would be my answer to Natalie's question. What are some everyday resources that queer people can use to protect themselves online?
Yeah, thanks, Gary. Thanks for. I was dealing with a little bit of technical difficulties on my end. So I'm glad that you guys are to get that going. Let's go to Anya next. So back to Web3. I just see Web3 as being such a solution for privacy and data issues, especially for marginalized folks like LGBTQ people, for example. But I want to ask, since I'm sure a lot of people listening in right now might not be familiar, is there a difference, do you think, between centralized and decentralized Web3 organizations? when it comes to privacy and data protection online?
Yes. So my mind is because a centralized organization, even though it's built on Web3, will collect data centrally. We'll still have central data able to also censor the usage of it. But it may have a better user experience because, as some of you maybe know that have been active in Web3, it's a horrendous user experience, right? Like, so it comes as a price to decentralization. So that's why centralized organizations that are using parts of Web3 still have a centralized, I call it point of failure, and point of censorship and point of data leakage, versus with completely decentralized organizations, they don't hold your data centrally. It's completely distributed, it's completely centralized. It's maybe about at the same time, right, like less intuitive because you may have to jump through some hoops, you have to manage your wallets, your access points differently. So that's for me the two different pieces. But in both situations, what I forgot to mention previously is you are able to create your own online personas and people will actually respect you for that. So in Web3, also probably Natalie, what you experience is people, like I still get addressed by my Twitter name, right? Like even though I use Jaded Banker, but people will address me as Jaded, and I could just push that through and create this persona and be my whole self without being judged. And this is something that I haven't seen yet in other situations. But so that's kind of like a safe space in that regard, versus like also in the other way though is we know that crypto and Web3, like some parts of it, and Natalie is working hard to change it. I kind of try to do my part, is very hyper masculine, right? Like it's playing to all those pieces. But what I've seen is though when I was addressing it and kind of making people aware of their behavior, they were really open-minded. So a bit away from the technology, but a bit more to kind of like driving the change. Because usually those are young people, like really young people. Gen Z is like very drawn to Web3 because it's like kind of the cyberpunk, like we're kind of like, we can do anything we want. So they're just unaware, but they are open for it. But again, back to the privacy, centralized organizations, even though you're using Web3 principles, still collect your data, still are able to censor it and decide what's going to be seen, versus completely decentralized. Maybe a bit worse user experience, but again, better control of your data. You get to decide what you're going to share. And again, it gives you more control.
Was very well put. Thank you for that. George, let's go on and ask, should governments protect tech companies from liability in the event of cyberbullying or hate speech? And I more into, I guess what amount of I guess just how should governments deal with that? What amount of effort should they put into that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a really interesting question, and I would love to also hear from Anya and Gary afterwards. But yeah, so let's say we're talking about government who are not outright against LGBTQ in the first place. So among these government who are more, I don't know, more democratic and more have a process oriented to make these decisions, I don't think this question will have a black and white answer, because on the one hand, if government just protect tech companies from those liabilities, like the tech company would argue like, yes, this will allow us to have more freedom of expression on our platform, because the tech company no longer need to deal with a potential legal risk by content that is posted on their platform. They will just they will save their costs on content moderation tools or teams. They don't have to worry too much about these legal risk. So like freedom of expression is one argument that is commonly used on this argument. And the second thing I think is like tech company would be inclined to say like, without these legal risk and liability, we're better able to encourage our innovation of product or growth of our product user base, because this way they can just focus their energy and investment on developing new features or new technology and services. But I don't see that as a very strong point, as like you can have these moderation policies in place while being able to develop new features or product ideas. I think there's a third argument that tech companies often use, is that by avoiding these liability, they can facilitate this, make sure the platform has the neutrality. So like, let's take social media platform examples. By maintaining a sense of neutrality, they are just going to be positioned as the intermediary of those content that is user generated, instead of like being the publisher of those contents. So this will allow those platforms to just host a much wider range of content without being seen as like endorsing or controlling any information that is shared by the users. However, personally, I think the lack of liability for these tech companies have some major disadvantages. I think during this Web 2.0 era, I think tech companies have been designing product and services not really having a respect for privacy in the first place or by default. And I feel like we're only taking a damage control approach to privacy and digital safety, because privacy is not that profitable as compared to new product introduction or user growth. To LGBTQ communities specifically, I think without these liabilities, it will disproportionately affect us. The algorithm, if they're not well maintained and well designed, the hate speech, the discrimination content, the harmful narrative or offensive words, those will be just amplified by those algorithm and backend systems. And so I feel like in the absence of some content moderation measures or tools, these hate speech may be just spread unchecked, and they will contribute to some real world harm or very severe consequences afterwards. And I think another point I have is that without these liabilities for tech companies, we're just creating a cultural norm in the industry. Like companies or businesses, they don't have to have these accountabilities for the abusive results that is caused by users. So I think like tech company will just have less incentive to proactively address any harmful or illegal content. I think this kind of environment or culture will make cyberbullying or hate speech or online stalking, make those more seen as like normalized. And because people don't get any punitive measures afterwards, they will just continue to do these behaviors without any checking. So I think, to me, maybe there's a middle ground in terms of how much effort government can provide. I personally see government can play this role of incentivize or encourage companies and business to take responsibility. I don't know what form of incentive that would be. That can be financially, or it can be some recognition of companies who are doing these self-regulation. And I believe that this kind of like positive incentivizing approach, this will just be more effective compared with either like companies avoiding from all liabilities entirely or enforcing too strong of a measure to limit the growth and innovation of tech companies. So I would love to also hear from Gary and Anya on this.
Awesome. Yeah, that makes sense. Gary, do you think, based on George's idea of government incentivization, either expanding on that or maybe even in addition to it, do you think that tech companies have a responsibility to protect the privacy of LGBTQ people?
I mean, yes and no. I mean, I'll be a little more clear, but George, that was really beautifully put. For context, what happened in May was that there was a case that involved Google, and then a law from '96, which has Section 230 of something called the Communications Decency Act, that basically would, like, the whole thing that was in play was limiting the responsibility of platforms from liability from user content. And sure, right, like it didn't go further, but the thing that really boggled my mind is that we are not close at all to resolving the very important question of what responsibility platforms should have for content posted and recommended by their site. And as you beautifully put, George, it's only getting worse. On the other hand, I told you at the beginning that I was French, and so therefore, one thing that I don't necessarily like is putting all of the responsibility, indeed, on tech companies who have a responsibility towards their shareholders. And sure, they should try to act ethically, but it boggles my mind that in 2023, the lack of there's no comprehensive data like privacy law that applies to U.S. companies. in the same way that you would have GDPR in Europe. So instead, American law is completely fragmented with different regulations, with different sectors and types of data. So to the question, do tech companies have a responsibility to protect their privacy? They do, and there's different ways in which they should. The first thing applies not just to queer people and trans people. It's that tech companies do need to be more transparent about data sharing. That's one that people should be able to know what information is being shared and how. And when we say notifying users, which is often used for tech companies, it also means notifying them in a way that they can understand, and keeping an open dialogue so that folks can ask questions about how the organization handles their data. And then, I saw a question in the chat from Sky about, making tech companies a safer space for queer people when it comes to all of these issues. I think there's a few things that tech companies should be doing. The first one, in the chat also, a lot of folks are talking about Texas and these stringent LGBTQ+ laws. I think now tech companies that employ queer people in these states should allow remote work, shouldn't force LGBTQ+ people to work in states where they could be criminalized. I think tech companies have a big responsibility and opportunity, really, to invest in employee resource groups and in LGBTQ+ people within their companies. They also have a responsibility to be explicit about not just their DEI beliefs, but their DEI commitments. And of course, ideally, to stand up to these anti-LGBTQ+ stringent laws. I think last I checked, there were over 500 anti-LGBT laws that were on the docket just for 2023. And so tech companies do have real sway when it comes to this. And then finally, I think tech companies should keep a feedback loop and mechanism with LGBTQ+ organizations. Like earlier, I talked about these TikTok slideshows, that have LGBTQ+ people. Unfortunately, when trying to reach TikTok, this doesn't go explicitly against their code of conduct, against their publication policies, but if only they spoke to minority groups, to groups that are targeted, I think that could make their product better and safer for LGBTQ+ people who represent a large slice of their platform. Sorry, that kind of went all over the place, but hopefully that covered a few of your questions.
Yeah, I'm just saying I have to agree with Gary again. As a European, it just shocks me like where we are in the US versus Europe from a privacy protection. And then also, I know that that the First Amendment in the US is completely protected in any way, versus I come from a state or from a country that regulates some phrases very heavily and sees them as hate speech, or actually some of them that are forbidden and that are really forced, right? Like even Facebook is actually forced to remove that if they post stuff in Germany about that. So it just, I think a different way to weigh the pro and cons of each, but yes, for me, it's kind of like make up your mind, try to create an overarching regulation, but also by privacy laws like GDPR, even though I remember working for Deutsche Bank, and I would love to take Sky's question, if that's okay, Natalie, about the global companies, because I also worked at Deutsche Bank. And
yeah, I was actually just noticing that you were taking it.
Yeah, I would love to take it just because. So I worked for Deutsche Bank in Frankfurt and London. I was the head of DB Pride in London. So that is Deutsche Bank's Pride chapter, right? Like they have different ones, right, like per country. And as part of that, we actually looked at like how can we create protections for our LGBT colleagues, right, like that are in Asia. Because we have a DB Pride group in India, we had one in Singapore, and so on, and they struggled with a lot of things and recognitions, right? Like because a lot of the bank's policies are really progressive, but they said, oh, spouse. But in countries where you cannot get married, right, like those coverage don't apply. So what we also saw is then, for example, one of my LGBTQ colleague transferred actually from London to Singapore. He had a partner. He was not even married, but he was in a stable relationship. And Deutsche Bank, like when they sent them out there, they worked together with other companies that they knew and created this network to find his partner a job. Right, like so what we've seen is, and what we've seen from a policy perspective, because that was one question, is those global companies, they're banding together and they're trying to create this network and try to work around the language to make sure that they're protected in that way and support each other. And also those LGBTQ organizations within those big companies, they are so important because they play this role that make people aware. Because a lot of times, like, there's just not an awareness of what we're running into if we go abroad, or like how like spouses are not recognized, like because like marriages, they're not recognized. So there is that, and then there's of course like the advocacy towards the government, but again, you got to work within some of the realms, right? Like in those countries, but you can create certain pieces to protect your colleagues in that regard. I mean, if you feel like the US is again like what I've seen with Disney and so on, it's been a bit different one. Maybe Gary or George or Natalie, you should take that, just because I don't know enough about the US system versus like saying, okay, like I've seen what Deutsche Bank had done working across, right, like different countries.
Yeah, absolutely. Tariq, do you think we should do the one last question or just or one last prompt for George, or dive right into questions? Let's go ahead and take maybe a minute or two, George. This is actually a topic we haven't really touched on, so I think it'll be interesting to ask you, how does privacy play a role in organizational trust and employee advancement and retention?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is also echoing Gary's earlier mentioning of like we need more LGBTQ people in tech, not just because we want to empower these individuals, but also because we need different perspective for the consideration of privacy, for the consideration of digital safety to be incorporated in the product and services. So when I think about privacy, like just like thinking like from my own perspective, if I were to apply for a job and recently there are a lot of privacy breach or like some online digital safety attack for the product or services of certain company, as an LGBTQ individuals, I will be particularly concerned because when their product and services are not ensuring that level of privacy and safety, I will start to doubt whether this company needs internal processes from hiring to learning and development to how they promote people, maybe, or like how they monitor everyone's everyday work, evaluate their performance. Maybe these internal processes are also not very safe in terms of like how internal employee data are shared, used, analyzed, and reported. So on that, I think trust and confidence will be one part of the impact that the privacy plays on this company's image to employees. So if you think about retention and employee satisfaction, when your employee feels secure and confident in their working environment, as well as the product and services that they're building, I think they will just experience a higher sense of psychological safety, which can lead to, job satisfaction or increased loyalty to the company, and eventually just reduce turnover. One more thing is also, I feel like if the employee feel like their ideas or like their data are just being shared in a very secure way, they're also more likely to be engaged in innovative work, let's say creative work, and maybe they will be more willing to take calculated risk without the fear of any retaliation internally. And then basically just they will be able to share and realize their ideas more openly. This can lead to also benefits to the company side, increase opportunities for industry innovations, product involved evolution, and all of that. So as the business grows, because they're paying too attention to privacy and digital safety, this also create more career growth opportunity, advancement opportunity within the organization. So I think, yes, we need more LGBTQ people in tech, and privacy and digital safety will play a huge role in how we're bringing those individuals to our industry.
Points. So I've gone through the chat, and I think we'd had that one question from Sky that Anya answered. Does anyone have any other questions? And feel free to let us know if you want one of the panelists to address them, or just anyone. And if we don't have any more questions, we still have a few minutes. So in that event, I would just go ahead and open the floor to any of the panelists. Final thoughts or words?
Yeah, I think Sky just responded to it. And I just what quickly say is like, yeah, companies being more inclusive is really important, and looking at all those benefits. So for example, also what we had in London was shared parental leave, meaning that my wife and I, we took actually leave for 6 months fully salaried at the same time, right? There was no differentiation between birthing parent and non-birthing parent. It didn't matter. They also had adoption leave, but like it's creating those inclusive policies. And also the mindset that Deutsche Bank had, for example, in London was like, bring your whole self to work. Because if you have to hide part of yourself, you're not, George, also to your point, right? Like you're not as productive, and you're not as willing to give your all to somebody that you don't feel right, like good. And also with the data, I was just thinking about it, like sharing the data. So companies, so we were also part of when I was in London, we were part of Stonewall, right? Like the best companies to work for. And like we had a massive survey on some of the questions. We didn't even have data, right? Like because it's an optional thing. So, but you only feel free to give your data, right? Like, and to out yourself if you feel safe, right? Like otherwise you will not provide that information. So that's kind of like also the other pieces, right? Like it comes back again, data protection. Do I feel safe with somebody giving my data, right? Like because as all of us, like every day we have to decide, do I come out again, right? Like to a client, to a colleague, to a partner that we've just met, right? Like so, and if we don't feel safe with somebody, even with that information, right, like we will not give it. Sorry, there was also a question for you, so I don't want to run over time.
Yeah, Gary, Rick asks, if you can share the tools you recommended earlier.
Yes, of course. Thank you for the question, Rick the Cowboy. And appreciated your comments throughout the session. So a few things I would recommend you check out. The first one is, well, first off, my organization is outandtech.com. And within Out and Tech, we do have a quarterly program called Digital Core, where we build websites for LGBTQ plus activists. You do not need to be a developer to participate. And so if you go to our website, Digital Core, our next one is in a couple of days, and we're building sites and tools for organizations in Kenya, in Uganda, and in just a few other countries. And it's a really, really great program to be able to interact with these organizations and see how you can contribute. Another one I mentioned is safequeers.org, and that provides you with some basic information as to how to stay safe online, specifically catered for people. And then I mentioned an organization called Frontline Defenders, which publishes cybersecurity guides for marginalized at-risk groups, actually including journalists. So anyone who is at risk of being hacked. So these would be the resources I'd recommend.
Awesome. And finally, Sky asked, any resources or books that on this topic? And I see George already recommended in the chat, The Fight for Privacy.
Yeah, that is a very fascinating book by the University of Virginia Law School professor, Dr. Daniel Citron. So this book is specifically addressing the challenges that women and LGBTQ communities are facing from the perspective of the concept intimate privacy. Like it's not just the law and regulation and policy, like on our individual human development perspective, like privacy play a huge role in ensuring that we have the human potential to thrive. So yeah, highly recommend this. I think one of the very interesting findings from this book, like there are a lot of research findings by the privacy scholars. One of the very counterintuitive data point is that so 75% of a survey respondent, they're under the mistaken impression that if a company has a privacy policy, then those companies would not share the data with other company. But that is absolutely not true, because tech companies always have data to be shared with third-party data processing companies or insights analysts, or like, you know, think tanks and all of that. But just because the consumer would not pay much attention to the detailed term condition of those privacy policy, they would not really get a chance to understand and evaluate their risk correctly. So I think echoing with Gary's earlier point, if companies have a way to make those explanations very simple, clear, direct to the customers in a way that is not like the 70 pages long, you just click the checkbox, that will be very, very empowering for consumers to make more more sound judgment about the risks they're facing.
And I actually have one book that I would recommend. I'm actually trying to answer the chat because it was only on my phone. But since we're running pretty short on time, it's basically, so it's called The Ministry for the Future, and it is a hybrid fiction / nonfiction book by Kim Stanley Robinson. So one thing I didn't mention in my intro, I'm involved in a think tank in Austin, which basically, just talks about the rise of AI and then privacy and ethics pertaining to that, and how AI should be regulated. So that's a very good book, The Ministry for the Future, if anyone is curious about the intersectionality of AI. And I think we're out of time, so thank you everyone for attending, and I hope that you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, Anya. Bye, George.
Bye, everyone.
Yeah.